Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 2021 video series for the CPT code set. For those of you who are enrolled in our CPC program, you are aware that our journey into the surgery section is about to take off. I do trust that you have reviewed the surgery section guidelines as well as you have completed chapter 6. We will be going over the questions in the textbook and the workbook in chapter 6 during our next live class. For those of you who are not enrolled in our program, if you want more information, please visit our website, which is listed on the screen. All right, so we are going to begin our journey today, and we're going to be starting on page 89 in our CPT manual, specifically our 2021 manual. I do want to acknowledge that the CPT code set is owned by the American Medical Association. And during today's webinar, while I will be referencing pages in your 2021 manual, I will not be showing those pages in this setting. Also, I do want to acknowledge that while I've tried my best to ensure that the code numbers and the ranges that I'm going to present are accurate as represented by the CPT coding manual, please note that if I've made a mistake, you'll want to make sure that you update the information on your end. So one of the things that's so very important about surgery coding is recognizing that it can be challenging. There are so many rules and regulations that you have to comply with. And so you're going to hear me so many times make reference to 4 types of notes. Those notes are the section guidelines, they appear in the beginning of the section. Then you have what are known as subsection notes. Those are paragraphs and sometimes pages of information that you have to read. Then we have parenthetical notes, and those are notes that appear either above a code family, below a code family, but they're in parentheses. And then the last area are going to be the coding tips that you will want to pay close attention to. Now, as a surgery coder, there are other references that we do use, one of them being CPT Assistant, which is a subscription-based service through the American Medical Association, or if you have some type of encoder product that has that software reference embedded, that is available to you. You will notice that for some of the CPT codes, they actually make reference to CPT Assistant. Lastly, one of my favorite references is the Coder's Desk reference from Optum. And what I like about that reference is that it gives me the English version of a CPT code. And at the end of the day, guys, whenever you see a CPT code procedure that you are not familiar with, the best way to learn about it is to research. I personally believe that either watching a video on the procedure being performed, watching a video that talks about the disease that the patient has that relates to that procedure, to me, that's what makes surgery coding a little bit more digestible. And notice I said a little bit because CPT coding can be hard. So we're going to start on page 89 in our 2021 CPT manual. And we're going to be looking at the fine needle aspiration biopsy codes. So the first thing I want you to notice is that there are subsection notes that are listed on this particular page. And while you're in the process of actually learning CPT coding, it is critical that you understand that now is the time to actually read those subsection notes, understand those subsection notes, and write any notes that you may need. So class, we're focusing on chapter 7, And it's critical that you do this real time, because once we finish with chapter 7, we're going to immediately go to chapter 8 and 9 and 10. And so doing this real time is going to be critical. Now, I think some people believe that you can learn coding overnight, and you absolutely cannot learn coding overnight. It does take time. And so it's not like a microwave where you push a few buttons and you want something done in a minute and it's over with. That's not how coding works. All right. So fine needle aspiration. So the first thing that you will notice after you go through the subsection notes is that the first two codes, 121 and 104, are fine needle aspiration without imaging guidance. You will further note that the first code is identified as the first lesion. The second code is listed as each additional lesion. You should further note that 104 has to be used in conjunction with 121. Additionally, you'll want to note that there is a pound sign in front of 104 that lets you know it's an add-on code. And what's the rule regarding add-on codes? Add-on codes can never be used alone. Add-on codes, we cannot assign or add a modifier 51 to that particular add-on code. So those are the first two codes. Immediately after that, the remainder of the fine needle aspiration codes on page 89 are divided based upon the type of guidance that is being used. So 105 is for ultrasound guidance, and it's the same format, first lesion and then the second lesion. When you go to 107, you'll see that that is fluoroscopic guidance. When you go over to 109, that is CT guidance. And rounding this family out, 111 is with MR guidance. Now, remember I talked about different types of guidelines that you're going to see. Underneath this family of codes on the bottom of page 90, you will note that there are some parenthetical notes. And some of the parenthetical notes relate to the fact that these codes are for fine needle aspiration. And so if a patient has a percutaneous needle biopsy, on page 90, they tell you what codes you should be using in addition to those codes. All right. So next, we are on page 90. And on page 90, under the integumentary system, skin, subcutaneous, and accessory structures, we have another set of codes that are going to just take us all the way through this integumentary system. So this is integumentary system. Those first codes are called the general section. So first we have code 130. And you'll notice that this is for image-guided fluid collection drainage by a catheter. You'll want to note that in parentheses, there are some specifics regarding body parts that are included. Immediately following that, there is a subsection note followed by two codes, 135 and 136, which focus on placement of a soft tissue localization device. There are parenthetical notes. You're going to hear me say that over and over again because I want it to be something that you live, breathe, sleep, think about. Those parenthetical notes, those subsection notes. All right, next up, we're going to go to incision and drainage. And so one of the things that you really want to think about as it relates to these codes is that each unique code has some type of distinguishing characteristic. I think of these codes like houses on a block. You know how each house, a different family actually lives in that house. And so I think of the codes like that because they are unique in their description. So on page 91, with our incision and drainage codes, what you will want to note relative to these different codes is that they're grouped together based on the type and the reasoning for the incision and drainage. So for example, on page 91, if you look at code 140, This is for acne surgery. Immediately following that, 160, 161, you'll notice that's for an incision and drainage of an abscess. So in the real world of coding, and we're going to talk a lot about how we code in the real world. I want you guys to remember that the purpose of your program here at Physician Practice Resources is not for you to just pass the exam, right? Passing the exam is just one day of your life. We want you to be able to do the job of a day-to-day coder, which is more than just flipping through manuals to locate codes. There is so much more to this process that we're really going to unpack as we continue this journey. All right, so immediately after that, you have 180, 181. You'll notice that those codes are for incision and drainage of a pilonidal cyst. Now, remember the word pilonidal cyst because we are going to see that again shortly. And this family here on page 91 continues with other types of incision and drainage. All right, next up, on the bottom of page 91, lower left-hand corner is where our debridement codes begin. It starts off with, subsection notes regarding debridement. And the one thing I will tell you about the CPC exam is when you're answering questions, those questions are designed to see if you know the rules. So taking the time now to build awareness that a particular rule exists will prove to be very beneficial on the day of your CPC exam or any other coding exam that you're taking, because remember, these exams are multiple choice. Real world coding is not multiple choice. So the objective is really for you to be able to select the correct code out of 4 multiple choice answers. And sometimes it's a guideline that's going to dictate your final code selection. So as it relates to debridements, the code families that we have available are divided based upon the type of debridement, the reasoning for the debridement. And so you'll notice on page 91 that the first 2 codes are for extensive eczematous or infected tissue, and they're divided by the percentage of the body surface. Immediately following that, the last code on the lower right-hand corner of page 91, those codes are for necrotizing soft tissue infection. You'll want to notice the differences in the code. So for example, I'm going to go over to page 92. You'll see that those codes are for abdominal wall with or without facial closure, whereas 11006 is for the external genitalia, peritoneum, abdominal wall with or without facial closure. So there's a couple of things that I really want you to pay close attention to. In our previous course, we talked about the standalone code and the indented codes. So on page 91, the lower right-hand corner, that's a standalone code. How do you know? It's not in lowercase. Whenever a code is a standalone code and it has a semicolon embedded in the description, what that lets you know is that it is part of a parent-child relationship. And the children, if you will, those are the indented codes, they rely on the description of the standalone code up to the semicolon. So for example, 11004, debridement of skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscle, fascia for necrotizing soft tissue infection, that is for a body part of external genitalia and perineum. Notice right before external, there's your semicolon. What that means is code 11005 is going to rely on the description of 11004 up to the semicolon. You drop down and pick up the rest of the description for your code. No, you're not reporting both codes. This was done to save printing space because some of the parent codes, the description is kind of long. And so if the AMA had to repeat that description over and over and over again, it would make this book even larger than it is today. As you transition to the other debridement codes, what you will notice is that they're divided based on specific purposes. It could be removal of foreign body at the site of an open fracture, or it can be the debridement codes that start at 11042, and those are divided based upon how deep that debridement goes. Again, I want to emphasize it's so important that you take the time to look at the codes that are available in a particular code family, noticing their differences. So, in a previous course, one of the resources that I told you about was CCO's bubbling, CPT bubbling process. I really believe that for a brand new coder who's learning CPT coding for the very first time, that bubbling and highlighting your manuals are important. Now, as a regular day-to-day coder, I don't bubble or highlight my manual because I've gotten used to the format. But for example, on page 92, 11010 through 11012, that's that debridement code for the site of the open fracture. And so one of the things you could do as a part of the bubbling process, and when we have our live class, I will actually show you some examples of what this looks like and some notations that I've made in my manual just to show you what it looks like. But if you put a bubble or a box around those three codes, 11010 through 11012, that reflects that that's one code family. And then within that code family, highlighting or underlining what's the differences between those three codes. So for example, 11010, that's skin and subcutaneous tissue. 11011, that's skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscle, fascia, and muscle. So I really think that that bubbling highlighting process is very beneficial. And let me tell you what's key and something that my previous students have said for years. I've been teaching coding and medical assistant and health information management since 1997. And something that I've heard over and over again is taking the time to put in the work now will benefit you when you get to the point when you are trying to study for your exam, right? When you're just in the review mode. Right now, you're in the learning mode. And it takes time, right? It takes hours upon hours to really jump into this material. All right, so we're going to say goodbye to debridement and we're going to head on over to paring and cutting, which is on page 93. So what you'll want to notice here, it starts off with a parenthetical note. You got to love those parentheticals. Immediately following, you have three codes in this code family, which are essentially divided based upon the number of lesions. It is worth noting that for paring or cutting, this is for benign hyperkeratotic lesions such as a corn or a calculus. All right, next up, we're going to go to page 93, and we have biopsy. And before I can even say it, I know you are thinking, wow, that's a lot of subsection notes for biopsy. And you should also be thinking, yeah, it's beneficial for me to read these subsection notes now, because what you don't want to do is be in a situation where you're taking your national exam and you're sitting there looking at the subsection notes for the first time. You want to look at your subsection notes while you're learning the coding process so that you can highlight areas that you want to highlight in a particular subsection note. If you need to define terms, you want to be able to do that now. Speaking of highlighting, I have proctored many AAPC exams where I've noticed that some individuals have their entire subsection note, page after page after page, highlighted. You don't want to do that. That's too confusing. On the day of the exam, you don't want to look at your book and everything is highlighted and you can't make heads or tails of information that's there. All right. So there's a couple of things that you need to know about biopsies. Number one, there are specific purposes for the use of these biopsy codes. And just note, in today's session, there is no way that I can cover each and every line, each and every concept for each and every code in this section. And so my desire for you is that you will take the time to read and digest the information. For those of you who are enrolled in my course, of course, you know that you can send me an email and ask questions real time about what we are covering for a particular week. Now, for those of you who work ahead, I want you to hold your questions, because with coding, you have to do one thing at a time when you're learning. When you're learning coding, you need to just really focus on one thing so that you can really digest that information. So, the biopsy instructions on page 93 will tell you that during certain procedures, excisions, destructions, shave removals are often submitted for a pathologic analysis. And what they tell you is that in those particular situations, the obtaining of that specimen is really part of the code assignment for those respective procedures. And again, please sit down and read through that information. The other concept that is worth noting is that there are different types of biopsies. So on page 93, you have in bold print tangential biopsies, punch biopsy, and incisional biopsy. So real world, our providers will tell us what type of biopsy they have performed, which will assist us with code assignment. Now, please note, and I'm going to turn over to page 94, that in the real world, sometimes providers don't tell us the information that we need, and we may have to query the provider for additional assistance. So on page 94, more subsection notes. Again, I can't get into all of those, but I do want to notate that the biopsy codes are divided based on those three types of biopsies. You will also notice that they're divided based on single lesion, each additional lesion. Notice that each additional lesion is an add-on code. So you know add-on codes cannot be used alone, and you cannot add a modifier 51 to those add-on codes. So guys, in my class, one of the reasons that I do these, I call them a pre-read, but it's like the video before we have our live session together. In our live session, I don't have time to cover all of these little intricate details that I am covering right now. And so it's so important that you continue to watch these videos prior to our live class so that you will ensure that you understand these basic concepts. All right, so enough about biopsies. On the bottom of page 95, we have our skin tags. And our skin tag codes are 11200, continuing on over to page 96 with 11201. Now, what you will want to note is that the first skin tag code on page 95 is for up to 15 skin tags. And then you'll notice in the add-on code 11201, there's this word that drives some of us crazy, but it's called each additional 10 lesions or part thereof. So what does that mean, or part thereof? That means any part of 10. So let's say you have a scenario where your provider has removed 16 skin lesions. So 11200 will be for the first 15 skin tags. And then that second code, which says each additional 10 lesions or part thereof, that would be for the additional one to give you a total of 16. So that or part thereof is important to note. So again, I cannot overemphasize. Now is the time to learn the different characteristics of these codes, because on the day of your national exam, you don't have time to figure out all of those things. You need to walk in the door of that exam having that basic foundation. Remember, all of the coding exams are timed, and you just have enough time to actually look at the question, select an answer, not trying to decipher information that's in your coding manual. All right, next up, we're going to go to the bottom of page 96 for shaving of our epidermal or dermal lesions. And here, what I want you to notice, first off, there are 3 families of codes that are represented here. Starting with 11300, this is for your trunk, your arms, or legs. The next family, 11305, that's for scalp, neck, hands, feet, and genitalia. And then 11310, notice that is for face, ears, eyelids, nose, lips, mucous membrane. So when you're looking at a scenario where you have to code shaving, you first want to identify your anatomic site, and then from there, you'll want to look at your size in centimeters. What if your provider documents in millimeters? It's 2021, guys. There are lots of calculators that you can use to do the conversion from the millimeters to centimeters. All right. So you will also notice that these codes are for a single lesion. So if you have more than one lesion that is being shaved today, you will need an additional code for each of those lesions. You do not add them together, and that is very important to note because in some other codes that we're going to look at shortly, there is an adding process that takes place. All right, so that's enough about shaving, and we're going to go on over to excision of lesions. Now, as it relates to the excision of lesions, there's a couple of things that I want you to just really commit to memory. Number one, as it relates to excision of lesions, you need to know if the lesion is benign or malignant. Your benign codes start on page 97. Your malignant codes start on page 99. So you first have to know the type. One of the things that I know that's often challenging for new coders is, well, how do I know if something is benign or if it's malignant? And that's where your terminology comes into play, okay? The second thing that I want you to know, and for those of you who may be experienced coders that may be listening to this recording, I hope that you do understand that I cannot cover every little simple thing in this video, and some of the things that a coder needs to know we actually cover in our live class, which my students are enrolled in, and not necessarily this particular video that is posted on multiple social media platforms. So the second thing that you will need to know after you know the type, benign or malignant, you also need to know what is the location of your lesion. So if you go to page 98, you'll notice that the first family of codes, 11400, that's for trunk, arms, or legs. But then the next family, 11420, you'll notice that that's for scalp, neck, hands, feet, genitalia. Then, if you go over to page 99, there's another family for benign lesions, 11440, and that's for face, ears, eyelids, nose, lips, and mucous membrane. And so you gotta know this information so that you can arrive at your correct code, but that's not it. So the type, you have to know the type, you have to know the anatomic site. All right. So there are some additional codes for benign lesions, but I wanted to just point out those 3 families right there. Okay, so back over to page 97. And some of these rules that I'm talking about for benign, they also apply to malignant, so we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone. All right, so the other thing that you will want to know, so the type, benign, malignant, the anatomic site, you will also need to know the excised diameter of your lesion. Now, according to the subsection notes, page 97, you can't get around reading them. Code selection is determined by the greatest clinical diameter of a lesion plus the margins. So on page 97, that concept of the excised diameter plus margins are illustrated on page 97. So if you look at example, we'll do example B on page 97. Excision of a benign lesion of the neck, 1 centimeter by 2. Let's pause. What does that mean? Code selection is determined by the greatest clinical diameter of a lesion. So in the example of 1 centimeter by 2 centimeter, the greatest of that lesion is 2. But code selection is determined by the greatest clinical diameter of the lesion plus the margins. So in this example on page 97, with letter B, what you'll notice is that the excised diameter is 0.4 on the top, 0.4 on the bottom. And so, or 0.2 on the top and 0.2 on the bottom. And so you add them together. Code selection is determined by the greatest clinical diameter of a lesion plus the margins. So you have 2.0 centimeters added with 0.2, 0.2, that gives you a grand total of 2.4. So that's the third thing that you need to know. All right. The other thing that's important to know, and this is more of a real world concept, is the excised diameter of the lesion is going to be captured from the operative note. You don't want to capture it from the pathology report. Why? When a provider takes a specimen out of the body, they put it into a solution to preserve the specimen as it's being transmitted, and oftentimes it will shrink. One of the things that I often say, that while I hated being a medical assistant, my medical assistant background, working side by side with providers, really comes in hand because I can visualize what's actually happening as it relates to these procedures. All right, so the other thing that you'll want to note is that, let's see here. Oh, the excision codes include simple closure. So our subsection notes lets us know that if the provider performs more than a simple closure, additional codes are required. So the rules that I mentioned for benign, you will also see on page 99 that they also will apply to the malignant lesions. Again, please take the time now to unpack every single page, every single code family as we are in this journey of the integumentary system, because after our next live class meeting, we'll be moving on to the musculoskeletal system. So very important, real time, take the time to check out these codes. So something else I do want to mention is that with the excision of the lesions, you are going to capture each lesion. You do not add them together. How do I know that? The code description says benign lesion, that's 1, or malignant lesion, that is 1. All right, so again, guys, much more to this process, but this is the basic of what I want you to know. I know that you're going to be reading the subsection notes, the parenthetical notes, all of it. All right, so next up, we're going to go on to page 101. And on page 101, we have codes for nails, and that would be fingernails as well as toenails. And these codes are differentiated by what's actually done to the toenails, whether it's trimming, whether it's debridement, whether it's avulsion of a nail plate. So take some time to review these particular codes. Immediately after that, on page 101, we have pilonidal cyst. Remember I said to remember that? That was important because on page 101, these are codes for the excision of the pilonidal cyst. Now, the previous codes were for the incision and drainage. This is for the excision as opposed to incision. So again, now is the time to really focus on evaluating these codes, the descriptions. Now, remember earlier I mentioned that one of my favorite resources for surgery coding is the Coder's Desk reference. So as it relates to 117707172, you have the differentiation of simple, extensive, and complicated. But in Coder's Desk reference, they actually give you a little bit more detail relative to what's the difference between these codes. And from a real world coding perspective, that layman's description of these codes are important, because one of the things that you don't want to do is to query the provider unnecessarily. Okay. Providers, guys, are very, very busy. And so we want to avoid asking them questions that we can actually find the information out ourselves. All right. Next up, we have codes for introduction, which start on page 101. And here, guys, there's a couple of different codes that are here. You have subcutaneous injection of a filling material such as collagen. You have insertion, removal of non-biodegradable drug delivery implants. So please take an opportunity to take some time to review those codes. All right, next up, we are going to go over to page 102, and here we have our repair codes. One thing that I want you to be aware of is on national exams, what they'll try to do is trick you, because they will give you scenarios where the wording looks the same, like the body parts are the same, but you really want to ask yourself is what procedure is actually taking place today. Okay, so repair, closures, those are for our lacerations. Now, a couple of things you'll want to know about repairs. Number one, they are divided based upon the complexity of the repair. And the repair can either be simple, as represented by the codes on page 103, continuing on to page 104. Bottom left-hand corner of page 104, we have our intermediate codes. And then on page 105, we have our complex repair codes. Now, on page 102, we have definitions of what's meant by simple, intermediate, and complex. Again, those are subsection notes that you will want to make sure that you review, because they are critical to your code assignment. All right, so as it relates to wound repairs, you do need to know the complexity, simple, intermediate, or complex. You also need to know your body parts. So on page 103, you'll notice that first code family of 12001, that is for scalp, neck, axillae, external genitalia, trunk, and or extremity, including the hands or feet. So you have to know the anatomic site. You also need to know the centimeters, the size in centimeters. Now, I want to point your attention to page 103 under the word repair simple. There's this sentence that's very important. Sum of the lengths of repairs for each anatomic site. So, what does that mean? That means that if you have a simple repair that falls under the anatomic sites for what's represented in 12001, you can actually add those together. Of note, very, very important, there are some rules regarding adding your repairs. If they are of different anatomic sites, you cannot add them together. If they are of different complexities, you cannot add them together. Again, lots of information to unpack with regards to the subsection notes on page 102 and 103, and I know you're going to read them. The last thing that I want to share with you on page 104, what you'll notice is that underneath each of these complexities, you have those different anatomic sites. So take the time to enclose the anatomic sites as a family. So for example, on page 104, 12031 through 12037, that is for one family. Another family, 12041 through 12047. Again, take the time now, guys. Put in the work, and trust me, it will benefit you. One of the things that you will hear me say in class often is that one of the things that I like about our CPC program is that it's not about you getting an A, B, or C, right? Because employers don't care if you have a 4.0 GPO. What they really want to know is, can you code with minimal assistance? And so that minimal assistance is going to require you to be in your coding manuals using some of the resources that we're going to talk about in our live sessions. And so don't worry about, oh, I got something wrong. Learn from that mistake and continue to grow. All right, so next up, the complex repair codes are on page 105, which then takes us to our next family of codes. All right, so on the bottom of page 105, we have our next codes, which are for adjacent tissue transfers. So starts off, guys, with, you guessed it, subsection notes. And one note that is very important is that as it relates to adjacent tissue transfers, is that they are used for excision, including the lesion and or repair by the adjacent tissue transfer. Now, one common, what I like to call rookie mistake, is missing the note at the bottom of page 105, which reads, the excision of a benign lesion or a malignant lesion is not separately reportable with 14000 through 14302. Again, remember, on the day of your national exam, you don't have time to be figuring out what these notes mean. You need to learn them now, because during the time test, you have this pressure of, I got to answer these questions during this time format. Well, if you take the time now to really evaluate and learn the rules, will you memorize them? Absolutely not, guys. Now, you will notice that there are some rules that I've memorized, but again, that's because A, I've been in this industry since 1992, starting off as a medical assistant, but two, I've been teaching since 97. So I have to repeat these rules to my students over and over and over again, okay? All right, so on page 106, you will see the different adjacent tissue transfer codes. You will notice that these codes are divided based on anatomic site. Also, look at the measurements here. They're square centimeters instead of centimeters, okay? Take some time to review what you have here. I'm gonna keep moving. All right, so next up, we have our skin replacement surgery. And on page 106, 107, I know, I can hear you. I can hear you saying, uh-oh, subsection notes. You got it. There are subsection notes that you will have to review. This code family on page 108 starts off with our surgical preparation codes. What you will want to notice regarding the surgical preparation codes, they are divided by anatomic grouping. Again, take the time to review those codes. Immediately after that, on page 108 on the right-hand side, you'll see codes for autografts or tissue cultured autografts. Auto means self. And so here you'll see codes for those types of procedures, and you will notice some distinguishing characteristics, terminology that you'll want to be familiar with. Now, guys, please remember, in our CPC training manual, at the end of the chapter, there's a list of terms that you should pay close attention to, as well as when you're reading the chapter, there are important definitions that you'll want to pay close attention to. And so these codes here, they have different characteristics. Pinch graft, epidermal autograft, split thickness graft, full thickness graft, if you're looking on page 109. And so paying close attention, guys, is going to be critical. All right, next up, we have our autografts, and it looks like I forgot to change some of the wording. So let me see here where I'm at. I might have just not retyped the codes. Nonetheless, I want to go over to page 110 because I want to look at the skin substitute graft codes. So on page 110, you have codes for skin substitute grafts, okay? Those are not the autografts. Auto means it came from self. Sometimes what happens is that the patient will donate their own tissue prior to surgery, and they'll culture it and preserve it and get it prepared. You can Google that process. But on page 110, these are for skin substitute grafts. All right, after that, on page 111, you have codes for our skin flaps or deep tissue flaps. Starts off with some subsection notes. You guys got it. And then we have several code families that are on page 111 and 112. All right, immediately after that, on page 112, we have codes that are classified as other flaps. Some of these other flaps include island pedicle flaps, fascial flaps, just to name a few. All right, after that, on page 114, we have codes for what are known as other procedures. And some of the other procedures that you see there, paniculectomies. We also see grafts for facial nerve paralysis. Take some time to explore those codes. On page 115, we have codes for pressure ulcers. And with the pressure ulcer codes, you will notice that there are some distinguishing characteristics. They're divided based upon if there is a flap closure, based upon whether there is an osteectomy, just to name a few of those distinguishing characteristics. Of course, if you notice on page 115, below code 15958, there are some parenthetical notes. Guys, you cannot get away from those parenthetical notes. All right, next up, we want to look at our burns local treatment codes on page 115. And these codes are referring to local treatment of the burn surface only. So there are some subsection notes for you to review on page 115. On page 116, you see a chart which breaks apart the percentages of the burns. Now, some of you are thinking, what's this Lund-Browder classification? You remember the rule of nines? You've heard of the rule of nines before. This is a classification that's similar to the rule of nines. CPT uses the Lund-Browder diagram and classification method for burns. All right, next up on page 117, we have our codes for destruction. Now, what you want to note regarding the destruction codes, first of all, there are subsection notes and parenthetical notes to kick off this particular section. Immediately after that, the first family of codes that you see are for benign or pre-malignant lesions. You will want to pay close attention to these descriptions because one word can change the description. So for example, 17000, this is for destruction, first lesion, pre-malignant lesion, okay? Then 17003, that's for second through 14 lesions. Watch this word, each. So second through 14 lesions, you can report a code for each lesion. You will not put a modifier 51 on those codes because these are add-on codes. Now, what happens if it's 15 or more lesions? Take a look at 17004. This is for 15 or more pre-malignant lesions. Immediately after that, you have cutaneous vascular proliferative lesions. Immediately after that, with 17110, you have more destruction codes, but these are for benign lesions other than skin tags. We've talked about skin tags before, or cutaneous proliferative lesions. So it's telling you, hey, these codes are not for those types of lesions. All right, so then after that, on page 118, we have our codes for destruction of malignant lesions. So guys, one of the things that I want you to think about, and this information is available on the AAPC's website. You're going to have 10 questions on the integumentary system on your CPC exam. And so as you look at all of this information here, you'll want to see that it's so important to take the time to review the subsection notes, review the parenthetical notes, make your own notes in the manual. We'll talk about those in our live class, in our curriculum. AAPC gives you notes of things that you want to write down in your manuals. And so you want to take the time to do that now, because again, once we leave integumentary system, this train keeps on moving to the musculoskeletal system, the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system. And so you want to take the time now. In our information packet for our program, we tell you that you're going to spend, 16 hours a week studying. You truly now, as we are knee deep into CPT coding, understand why that is the case. All right, so the malignant codes, what you will notice that they are divided into anatomical groupings. You will also notice that they are organized by lesion diameter, which is reported by centimeters. And then I do want you to notice is that these codes say lesion. So each lesion can get a code. You do not add them together. All right, next up, we're going to go to Mohs Micrographic Surgery on page 119. So on page 119, Mohs Micrographic Surgery. This is a procedure where the surgeon is going to act as a surgeon and a pathologist at the same time. I have to tell you, I'm definitely a coding nerd because I was driving with my husband one day. We were heading to the mall here in the Chicagoland area, and I saw a Mohs Micrographic Surgery Center, and I just went crazy because with coding, it's critical that you're able to visualize what you're coding. And so diagrams, research will prove to be very beneficial for your career. Again, this is not about you being an A coder, okay? I will tell you that I would personally hire someone that is a B coder that can code, that can research, that understands the concepts, than someone who says, oh, I got all A's in my program. And that's why in our program, there is no A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because it's about just focusing on learning the craft, okay? All right, so with your Mohs Micrographic Surgery codes on page 119, what you will notice is that the first two codes are for specific anatomic body parts, okay? And the second two codes are for specific anatomic body parts. The other distinguishing characteristic, and this is very important, this is really kind of deep here, but you'll notice that the first code in each of the family, 17311, 17313, are for first stage up to 5 tissue blocks. Google Mohs Micrographic Surgery to learn more about blocks, okay? The second code, 17312, 17314, you'll notice these codes say each additional stage after the first stage up to 5 tissue blocks. So the first code, 5 blocks. The second code, 5 blocks. First code, first stage. Second code, each additional stage after the first stage. So yes, in the documentation, the provider will say first stage, second stage, third stage, okay? Speaking of, you got this concept here, 17315. This says each additional block after the first 5 tissue blocks. So in our workbook, we're actually going to have an example, actually in the textbook and the workbook, I believe, we're going to have an example of coding this. And so I really want you to take some time to read through this because it's going to be very important to code assignment because we are going to have a scenario where the provider does 6 tissue blocks. And notice that each code says up to 5 tissue blocks, right? 17315 is when we have each additional block after the first 5 tissue blocks any stage. When we get to that exercise in our class, you'll actually be able to pull that concept together. All right. Lastly here, starting on page 119, I want to try to keep this to an hour, so I think I'm doing good. On page 119, we start our procedures on the breast. And our procedures on the breast first start off with puncture, aspiration of the cyst. What you'll notice with these two codes is that imaging guidance is not included. There is a parenthetical note that states that if imaging guidance is performed, you're going to be using an additional code. All right. On page 120, more subsection notes. All right, so as it relates to the subsection notes, I do want you to notice that they are defining the different breast biopsy procedures, that they can be performed as either percutaneous or they can be open with and without imaging guidance. That information is so important because some of our codes are divided based upon whether or not imaging guidance was performed. When we go over to page 120, you will see breast biopsy codes with the placement of a breast localization device. The differences in these codes on page 120 is that they're divided based upon the type of guidance that's actually used during this breast biopsy procedure where they are placing the breast localization device. Now, page 121, we're going to get into another set of codes, and this is called Introduction, more subsection notes for you to read. And on page 122, you'll notice, hey, these codes also say placement of a localization device, but they're not a biopsy. So I want you to tell me when we have class, what's the difference between the codes on page 120 and the codes on page 122. And I will know if you have really been digging in. All right, so after that, we have codes for our mastectomy procedures. They're divided based upon the type of mastectomy, and that's on page 123. And then our repair and or reconstruction codes actually got a redo for 2021. So that's why on page 123 and 124 and 125, you see this green. It's green everywhere. Why? Because these codes were revamped for 2021 to align with current practice. And so anytime these updates are made, they put them in green so that they can pop out for us so we can govern ourselves accordingly. All right, so on page 125, you'll see codes for breast reduction, breast augmentation, all different types of breast reconstruction that can be performed. Then we have additional codes that are on page 126, and that is the end of the 10,000 series. For those of you who are not a student of ours, as well as those that are, please follow us on social media. All of our social media channels are listed as PPR Corp. So that's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then we are also on LinkedIn. You are actually watching this video more than likely on my YouTube channel, which is Dr. Lisa Campbell. And for those of you, again, that are interested in learning more about our program, you can find them on our website, ppr-corp.com, and our telephone number as well as our email address is listed here. Thank you so much for listening. Those of you who are in my class, I'll see you in our next live class session. Happy coding.